Global Indian Network. Print, TV, events, podcasts. Find out more at globalindianseries.com.
Welcome back to the Global Indian Podcast, home to the greatest conversations and the official platform for open and liberal minds. Because yes, let's face it, we are everywhere. Now, as you know, every single week we plunge into the human experience behind our perceptions of identity, take a second look at the countries we now call home, and tackle the big conversations. Well, this week is slightly different. We go over to the wonderful Oceania world, where I'm joined by Aisha Khan, who's our head of the Oceania Global Indian series, where she tackles for the next couple of weeks the ideas surrounding Fijianness. What does it mean? And having a look at how the tentacles of the communities have spread right the way across the globe, and the re-understanding of what it actually means for the second, third, fourth, and even fifth generation people. This week, she's joined by the wonderful Angelene from the podcast No Ties, where she has a re-look at the understanding of what it means to be a Canadian Fijian, and going beneath the surface, peeling back the onion layer skins to see what the life is like through those eyes. But before then, a quick note from our dear sponsors. If you want to find out more about the Global Indian series, by the way, well, it couldn't be easier. Simply come to the website, which is www.globalindianseries.com. There you can listen to this podcast and the entire repertoire of discussions so far.
Hi, this is Damesh Shingala, co-founder of Novus. At Novus, we believe technology leads the way for a meaningful change. We are on a mission to change the way corporations, governments, and institutions interact with information. Same as the Global Indian podcast, help people transform for a better future. Find out more on how we are inspiring global change, either at the Global Indian Series website or Novus website to learn more about our innovative software solutions. From our family to yours, I hope you enjoy the show. Thank you.
My name is Chitra Stern, and I am a proud Global Indian Ambassador and CEO of Martinal Resorts and Martinal Residences. We pride ourselves on the journeys that define a community, and our developments bring people together. Did you know that over 70,000 people just like us call Portugal home? The Global Indian journey has brought people together in a meaningful way, and on behalf of all of us at Martinal, we want to thank you for joining us in these remarkable conversations. We look forward to seeing you here in Lisbon post-COVID.
Hi, my name is Divya and I'm co-founder of the Global Indian Podcast. Before you get to today's show, I've got a quick favour to ask. If you've been enjoying our conversations, I'd love if you could take just 1 minute to leave us a review on the platform that you're listening to us on and share our work to friends and family. It helps us out a lot. Word of mouth is the primary way that we grow. Thanks for your continued support.
So without further ado, I'm going to sit back with my coffee this morning. Aisha, welcome on your maiden voyage and the Global Indian Podcast.
Thank you. No pressure. Thank you.
No pressure, immense pressure. Over to you.
So, kicking it off, what does it mean for you to be Indo Fijian? And what does it mean for you to be Indo Fijian in Canada?
Good question. It means a couple things, and I think for myself personally, just want to say right off the bat that I don't want to speak for, all Indo Fijians and all Fijians here in the diaspora, but for myself specifically, I feel, like being Indo Fijian for me means, maybe I'll start with the negative first. It means essentially being this person of no nation. I feel very disconnected. Simply, being in Canada, of course, proximity is one thing, but, just even with the history of Fiji and why Indians were there, and then, the subsequent coups, and, the racism that post-colonialism left behind. I certainly feel a sense of displacement and there doesn't really feel a lot of ownership for us being anywhere. And similarly here, being in Vancouver as well, growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood away from the predominantly what we call brown areas here in the greater Vancouver area, there's been certainly a huge disconnect with not growing up within the dominant brown culture, or even, the Indo Fijians that are here. Lots of disconnection with, this intersection of growing up in a white neighborhood and not necessarily relating very well to, the Fijians who grew up in the brown neighborhoods, and, not being able to have the same experience. So, there's certainly some identity confusion and identity issues that have happened growing up. But what being Indo-Fijian also means to me is extreme pride in this very unique diaspora, and this very unique intersection of these cultures who found themselves having to coexist. And, something that came out of that has been this very, very interesting and fused cultures of, two cultures that would never really meet in any other sense, right? It's very interesting how we've been able to, weave native Fijian culture into our Indianness to create this Indo-Fijian culture. And so, I will say that it has been extremely challenging to come to terms, I guess, with our identity, but also just celebrating the beauty that it really is.
So does the geographical distance from Fiji, being in Canada and really feeling, like you said, not having any ties, is that where the name of No Ties came from? No Ties?
Absolutely. Yeah. Good question. Yes. No Ties, No Ties 1879 is the title of our podcast. And, we went through months of trying to come up with a name for a podcast, and nothing seemed to fit, or, there were copyright issues that we didn't necessarily want to have to deal with in the future. And so we kept on saying this phrase, though, no ties, for months, through our research, through planning for episodes, explaining our why to a lot of people. We kept on saying no ties. We feel like we have no ties to this land here in Canada because we grew up far away from the diaspora and not necessarily immersed in Indo-Fijian culture here in Canada. And then my parents fled in 1987 from Fiji, and they were here as refugees. And, there have, of course, been subsequent coups, constantly trying to, push out the Indian population. And, there's definitely a sense of no ties to the Fijian land. And of course, with, it being so many generations at this point, even though our Indo-Fijian culture is very much so rooted in our religion, mine specifically being Hinduism, which is, from India, that's really the only connection there really is. But there's really no other connection that we have to India. At this time, I still can't identify exactly where my grandparents came from in India. And so there's no ties. And so no ties was just supposed to speak to our, disconnect that we feel with the land and the culture. And then 1879 was very intentional to, highlight the year that the Leonidas arrived in Fiji, carrying the first set of indentured laborers.
So did growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood, did that make you maybe hang on to your family a bit more because you felt that there wasn't much support from outside or familiarity?
Good question. I would say it probably did the opposite.
Okay.
I think that there was for my brother and I both, very much so, and probably more so for him growing up, there was a bit of a sense of internalized racism. And there's having been there, I feel like I can identify it a lot sooner these days when I see it. But I think that there was a lot of pressure. You know, growing up is hard, being a kid, youth, high school, it's rough enough as it is. Fitting in is hard. Fitting in as a dark-skinned person of color in a white neighborhood full of fishing and farmer families, there was a lot of pressure to try to fit in. And so there was, you know, I was an athlete. I played all the sports. I, you know, did all of the things to try to immerse myself into what it meant to live in small town Canada.
Right.
And I did succeed for a very long time. But, you know, as you grow up and, you know, kids turn into teenagers and start to ask questions, you realize that you're not the same as everyone, and that there isn't really a point to try to be like everyone else, because, you know, before I'm a kid from Ladner, the town that I grew up in, I am a person of color. I am an Indo Fijian kid growing up in a white town. And so, you know, there was a lot of struggle with trying to be like the white kids, as in, you know, engage in the same activities, you know, do the regular grow up things like, you know, go to parties and socialize and have friends and, you know, boyfriends and relationships and stuff like that. And of course, none of that was allowed. None of that was, you know, fit within the scope of what my parents thought it meant to, you know, grow up here. And so there was a lot of, you know, pulling away and not necessarily going to them for support for anything, because, you know, they didn't necessarily understand what it was like to grow up the way that I did. You know, they grew up with their own people. And yes, you know, they certainly did face some racism when it came to, you know, the indigenous Fijian population and the Indo Fijians. But, you know, this is different. And so there wasn't a lot of, you know, support. They didn't necessarily know how to support us. And so, you know, I kind of did the thing where I tried my best to fit in with certain people. And there were other, you know, Indian folks that were, you know, from Punjab here. You know, there was like a small group of, you know, 10 of us. We all, you know, find each other, and that's kind of like the the circle of safety. But you know, when it came to being able to relate to anyone, or, you know, being able to have those supports, there wasn't really anything that existed, unfortunately.
Right. You know, I feel like as kids and even as teenagers, we don't really have a lot of control over the physical environments that we grew up in, or the personal environments that we grew up in. And now as an adult with the No Ties podcast, do you feel, you know, now that you have a certain amount of control, do you feel that there is a belonging, a sense of community with other Indo Fijians, whether it be physically or online, because you now have the power to actually reach out and do things your way?
You know what? It's been pretty amazing, I'll say. We really didn't know what was going to happen when we made the podcast. We had to think about it for a while. I more so was very concerned about perception, you know, the optics from family, how are my parents going to feel with us, you know, putting toxic Fijian culture on blast, essentially outing, you know, our upbringing and, you know, the negatives that we saw from it. But we really, really strongly felt like there's no way that this is just us. There has to be other people out there who feel this way, not even necessarily folks, Indo-Fijian folks here in Canada, but, you know, like folks from other brown diasporas, and, you know, the Filipino diaspora here is quite large as well, and we seem to have a lot of cultural parallels. And so, you know, with having these conversations about our generational trauma and digging deep into our background and our heritage, we just kind of felt like there's got to be other people out here who feel the same way and want this connection, are really, really lacking it, and are craving it. And so, we did what we did. We started a podcast. We started honestly and openly talking about everything, and the response has been incredibly positive. Lots of DMs, and people in our comments reaching out all the time about how having these conversations have helped them to start dealing with their own stuff, and have encouraged them to seek out therapy, or to have these conversations with their parents as well. One of the things that I found really beautiful about doing this is that other millennial Indo Fijians here have started talking to their parents about Girmit and asking them questions and trying to get to the bottom of their own trauma. And that's really important to me, because we only have so long left to be able to document our ancestor stories, and there's so few people left who know them. And unfortunately, these weren't things that were actively talked about in our household. And at this point, our parents and our family members who we do reach out to almost feel this like immense regret for not asking their parents and grandparents more questions about the experience, to be then able to pass down the stories. And so I'm really grateful for the conversations that our podcast has sparked.
As a descendant of Girmitias, there is undeniably a lot of generational trauma, whether or not we want to accept it or not. I feel like our generation is more aware of that, but do you think that our parents' generation is aware of the fact that there is trauma and that it's very real?
In my personal experience, I would say not a lick.
Yeah.
I wish it were different. Of course, I wish that were not the case, but I think that even us, as being in our 20s and 30s and realizing it right now, is a testament to our parents' experience and how they have like no idea, right? If we're only coming to terms with it now, of course they have no clue. And so I think that there is, not even like a lack of self-awareness, but even a sense of denial, right? There can be denial in that, oh no, that's not, I hear a lot of the past is the past. You don't need to, like, what's the point? You don't need to dig it up. And that's a part of their trauma speaking. So so no awareness, I would say.
So basically pushing things under the rug.
Yes, absolutely. That is the norm. Mm-hmm.
How, as someone that does the kind of work that talks about these things, what do you think is the best way to actually deal with the trauma for maybe teenagers or younger people who follow our platforms? What do you think we could tell them about how to start navigating that feeling? Because it is very real.
I am a very blatant advocate for regular therapy. I started going to therapy myself, I'm going to say 4 or 5 years ago, and I don't think that I will ever stop. I have been able to learn so much about myself and gain so much self-awareness. And I also understand how lucky and privileged I am to be able to, go to therapy and also have a therapist who, doesn't come from an Indo Fijian background or any brown heritage background, but is very aware of who I am and is extremely supportive, and has been, has gone out of her way to educate herself and learn so she can best support me. And so, I know that that's not the case for everyone, unfortunately. And so I understand how privileged I am to have that as an asset. But therapy, huge advocate for therapy. Please go to therapy. And also, just being real, but like, when we set out to do this podcast, something that we said out loud was that we want to be that Bea, that Gigi that we never had when we were growing up. Right? We really needed someone to validate our experience and support us, and we didn't have that. And so to find that is very, very important, to have some sort of mentor, or someone who understands your experience and validate you is extremely important. And so having that, I would say, has been huge, because even through starting the podcast, we have been able to create these connections with people who really have become our chosen family, who have stepped in ways that our blood relatives never could. And so community is so important. Community is extremely important. And so that is something, if you can make happen. Technology also allows us to be able to connect with folks, in 3 different time zones like we are right now.
Yeah.
And so fortunately, we don't have to, be in the same town or city even to be able to connect. And so finding your people doesn't always have to mean, proximity and being close by. It might mean that you have to reach out virtually. But that again, it has also been such a gift to me that I'm grateful for, to find folks like yourselves and others who can relate to our experience and validate us, and we can do the same.
Mm-hmm. You previously talked about how your parents fled Fiji because of the coup, and they were refugees, and the coups very obviously led to a lot of racial tensions and maybe increased racial tensions that were already there. Have you, living where you are, have you had to deal with microaggressions in terms of the two parties? Has there been misconceptions that you've maybe had to clear up on your podcast, even if you may not live in Fiji?
I think that for the average Canadian person, someone who says that they're Fijian is confusing for them, because even though the diaspora here is very, very small, the Indo Fijian diaspora specifically, the indigenous Fijian diaspora is even smaller. And so I think that, for the, average Canadian who, was not, typically we're not taught about, South Pacific cultures and regions. No one here really knows what being Fijian is, or what a quote unquote typical Fijian would look like. And so I have had questions about why is it that I look the way that I do, but maybe another Indo Fijian is lighter skinned, and then another Fijian is not necessarily Indo Fijian, but they look like they more so resemble a Black person. And so there's definitely been confusion from others and clarifications to be made. I personally don't have any close friends who are Indigenous Fijian here, because the community is smaller, and as challenging it has been to connect with Indo Fijians here, it's been more challenging, to connect with Indigenous Fijians here. I think that there's also been a perception that because when the Indians went to Fiji, they were, people of color, that there shouldn't necessarily have been any racism. I've definitely heard from some white people here that they don't understand why there would be any issues, because it was, the white people who took the Indians to Fiji and then they left and, everything should have been okay. And of course, we know that that was not the case. And so, there's been a lot of it having to explain that here. And in a sense, when I hear certain comments like that one about like, oh, I don't see what the problem is, I do kind of take that as a microaggression for sure.
Yeah.
I get things like, if your parent or if your family or if Fiji was a third world country, why did your family go there from India? Why did they move to another third world country? And so I think that there's a lot of there's just no education, right? Like there's just no understanding of what it means to come from Fiji and what the history is. And sheer ignorance definitely leads to a level of microaggressive comments that I think a lot of the time seem lighthearted and seem like they're coming from a good place. But 30 years later, it definitely becomes old. It starts to get more and more challenging to have to explain everything to people, and especially when they don't necessarily want to hear it in a sense either, right? There's always like the but what about this? Yeah, but what about this?
Just leading on from that, do you think I know that the lack of education and the lack of awareness about indenture means that I personally, as an Indo Fijian, I find myself having to explain the whole story of what indenture is to people who don't know what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, the reactions sometimes are that they don't want to hear it, or that they may not feel that our ancestors' struggles were that bad.
Yeah, it's not that bad.
Yeah. Have you dealt with that, and how does that make you feel, especially knowing what our ancestors went through?
It makes me feel really sad. In layman's terms, it makes me feel really sad. It makes me feel completely invalidated. It makes me feel like there's some sort of victim Olympics that we're out here trying to compete in. And that is something that I do not do, is compete in the victim Olympics. I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in multiple marginalized populations here arguing over whose issues are worse and which ones are more important to focus on. I feel like that tends to happen a lot too, unfortunately. And I also do hear a lot of this feedback of like, well, that doesn't sound that bad. It was only 5 years. They could have done whatever they wanted to afterwards. And we know that it just wasn't that simple. I also hear a lot of feedback, especially online, on TikTok specifically, that there was a lot of Indians who made the choice to go. They chose to go. So, it's all good. They chose to go that and they wanted that. And I'm like, you can't make an informed choice when you're lied to and manipulated. So I don't believe that anyone wanted and voluntarily chose to enter into this system. If they knew what it was going to be, then I don't believe anyone would choose that. The argument that the circumstances in India were dire anyways, and so maybe they were just trying something else, like they were taking a risk to see if it would work out. And yeah, sure, maybe that's the case, but we can say with confidence that no one was told the truth, no one was sold the real story, right? So I certainly I feel very invalidated, and I feel sad when I hear the stories of the few stories that I do have from my parents, who were told some stories from their parents and their grandparents about how the white man would come on the horse with his chabuk, with his whip, right?
Yeah.
And if they weren't working, they would get whipped.
Mm-hmm.
And here in North America, that is a very familiar story that we hear, whenever we talk about the enslaved Black peoples in America and the marginalized Native American population, we hear those exact same stories. But because we're not, I don't know, maybe because we're not, we're from somewhere else, we're not of this land, and our diaspora is not big enough, and also because, or it's not, sorry, as big as the Indigenous populations here and the Black population here. And our experience, or, our ancestors' experience was one under a contract. Apparently that means that it really wasn't that bad. So it's a hard conversation for me to navigate sometimes, because I don't want to get caught into the trap of trying to play the victim Olympics, of trying to be like, but no, it was bad. It was bad. It was.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a tough one.
All right. And as we wrap up, what are your goals for the No Ties 1879? And what are your few words of wisdom for the young listeners today?
The goals for the podcast is for us to continue to create community, for us to amplify our culture here, and let the wider world know that we exist. That is a huge goal of mine, because a lot of what we heard growing up was, Fiji, where's that?
Mm-hmm.
Is that somewhere close to India? Oh, that's close to Africa, right? So, putting Fiji on the map here in Canada, making sure that it's recognizable, and that we are recognizable, and that our experience is validated, and that the indentured labor system is exposed. We really want the wider population to know that this system was implemented and existed post-slavery in America, because it just continues to validate that, colonialism affected, every corner of the earth. And no, they didn't stop doing the things that they were doing. They were just reimagining them and putting them in different places, And so it's very, very important to me that we expose this system and ensure that the wider world knows about it. We want to build community and ensure that, us, the millennial population, and that the Gen Z population coming up right now, that like we build this community and ensure that everyone has the support and resources that they need to validate their experience, and get active if they want to, and that their voice matters. I am certainly a very huge racial justice advocate here in Canada and in BC, where I live. But there's a lot of other issues that I'm extremely passionate about, like menstrual justice and equity, which is also hugely rooted in our religion and our culture. And I enter those spaces knowing that someone who looks like me has not been in those spaces before. And I want to ensure that my nieces know that they can do what they want, and that they can say what they want. And when they say something, that they will be heard.
All right. I'm sure you are going to achieve all of your goals, and I can't wait to see how you proceed.
I think
Thank you for your time.
That was really... Before we wrap up, just a quick question. Fiji means something to you, Angelene. Do you think you mean anything to it?
Such a great question. I think that there will come a time where the recognition from Fiji will come in a way that it hasn't already before. There are Indo Fijians here that are getting recognition for their achievements, such as, you know, academic and, you know, like opening up a law firm, which are, you know, amazing things. You know, we want to keep up with the Indo Fijians in all diasporas doing incredible things and making moves. I really do hope that our work here is recognized by the Indo Fijians and the Indigenous Fijians still back at home, because if it weren't for them, we wouldn't be here doing what we're doing. And it's not just about the Canadian Indo Fijians here getting the validation and recognition that we deserve. It's about the entire nation, because we know that, you know, there are other issues that the islands are dealing with, you know, when it comes to climate justice. And it's important that their voices are included in so many social justice conversations that are happening right now. And I feel like we get excluded a lot. And so I certainly do hope there comes a day where, you know, our podcast and our team here, you know, that we've grown to get close to, are synonymous with amplifying the culture here and making sure that, you know, I guess making sure that, you know, our what am I trying to say here? Making sure that
the voice is recognized, isn't it? It's
our voice is
sure.
recognized, but they know that we were here. Yeah, making sure that folks know that we were here and that we did that we were distinct, and that, you know, we're not necessarily pooled up with everyone else as much as we do stand with our Indigenous brothers and sisters here on Turtle Island. That's very important to us, to stand with our Indigenous brothers and sisters and our Black brothers and sisters here, because without their efforts, we wouldn't be here, right? We directly benefit from the work that they do here. Our experience is valid, it is a real thing. And yeah, I hope that there is some recognition for that from home.
That's interesting. All right. Well, Aisha, that was your maiden voyage. I think you did incredibly well. It was really interesting sitting on the sidelines as well. And thank you so much, Angelene, for taking the effort to come on the show as well, to kind of explain more about that, because I know from the global perspective, people are not familiar enough with what indentureship is. And as you're pushing onto that point, when you look at the statistics, even in the Caribbean side, up to 50% of the people died in the ships on the way there. This was, and I like the way that you placed it, it's actually very beautiful. It's not the victim Olympics, but we have to also do justice to the human stories that most people quite often intentionally negate. The fact that indentureship was a very cruel system. It was based upon slavery. There may be a contract of sorts in place, but that contract was definitely voided because everything was falsified. And the reality is most people, in order for them to leave the plantations that were on, had to have some form of passport to go as little as 2 miles away. So this was not about independence or people going over than a jolly of going to a country and making money and sending it back home. No, this was a really cruel system that was set up. And I think it's good that the world knows more about that in the face of what it is to be human. And I think what you're saying earlier, and I know it's a very tough subject, but we can't have a select moral outrage when we look towards certain particular things of the past, because then all of a sudden we become this zebra-like nation, where it's a binary code of one community there and another community there. And at least we forget, I think, the 50 Shades of Brown in which we belong to, there's been a lot of cruelty along that journey. But also there's been a lot of interesting insights into what determines our understanding of the world around. Anyway, that was my Jerry Springer moment. It was really good to have you on. Aisha, well done. I'm now going to officially end the conversation here. But if people want to find out more, Angelene, very quickly, where do they go? What is the website that they need to type into?
Yeah, just check us out on Instagram. We are at No Ties 1879 podcast on Instagram and TikTok. You can check out the link in our bios that will lead you to all of our episodes, resources, things that we've got going on, things like that. So, yeah. And
to find out more about the Gurmit Diaries, where do people go to, Aisha?
It's Gurmit Diaries on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. You'll find us there.
What an incredible conversation. A first of many more coming from the Global Indian series Oceania side. Aisha Khan was your host there. It's a really interesting discussion piece because there's a quote that Angelene made, which was the idea of the victim Olympics. I think that carries a lot of weight, especially in these day and ages where we live in, where it tends to feel that there is a select moral outrage, especially when people discuss the past. It is really, really fascinating Canada as a destination because you have almost a 50 Shades of Brown that have rediscovered themselves there, but also started to uncover where their place in the world is. As always, I really hope you enjoyed this podcast, and I look forward to enjoying furthermore later on this week as we continue our 50 Shades of Brown discussions, uncovering the stories right the way across the planet. Until next week, I hope all remains well. Take care for now.
Global Indian Network. Print, TV, events, podcasts. Find out more at globalindianseries.com.